So I'm going to make a few comments that relate to last week, just to clear some things up. First, I wanted to mention there's, in all my studying, I notice frequently there's a shift in the date sometimes by 1 year. And I always wondered, what is going on with the dates? That this book says it happened in this year, and that book says it happened a year later or a year earlier. And I didn't know this, but I recently discovered that in England, up until 1750, New Year's Day was on March 25th, not January 1st, as we customarily think. So if the date happened, say, March 22nd, the year would be different. But if a person's looking back and say, oh, it happened in March, that must be this year. So quite often in the first 3 months of the year, the date could be off by a year. Now, there is one person I can't see, but maybe you're there on purpose? The good-looking lady right back there. Well, I like to see you, sure. I like to keep an eye on you. So, I learned something last week, and somebody else learned something too. My friend Jane was here, and she grew up in the Roman Catholic Church. And we got last week talking a little bit about purgatory, and she said, no, that's not what purgatory is. It's just a holding place. It's not a place of suffering and torment. Well, that's different. I didn't say much about it because I didn't want to disagree with her. But I went home and studied more on it, and so did she. And we both discovered that at the time we're talking about, purgatory was a place of torment and suffering. But sometime since then, it's changed. So purgatory is no longer a place of suffering. It's now just a holding place. But I'm going to talk a little bit about purgatory. So at the time we're talking about, it is a place of suffering where you get purged from your sins. That's why it's called purgatory. If you paid money to the Roman Catholic Church to buy what's called an indulgence, you could shorten the time that you spend in purgatory, or you could shorten the time that one of your relatives or friends spent in purgatory. This issue applies to what we're going to be talking about because it comes down to the canon of Scripture, which once I get up to 1611, which is going to take me 2 weeks, tonight and next week, then I'm going to stop the history of how we got the Bible in English, and I'm going to go back and talk about the canon of Scripture, which refers to what books are in the Bible and what books are not in the Bible. And this has to do with that question because the Roman Catholic Church gets the idea, or at least claims to get the idea, from one verse in the book of 2 Maccabees, chapter 12, verses 41 to 46. And it refers to making atonement for the dead. And so from that developed the idea of purgatory. Well, the interesting thing is, the Roman Catholic Church accepts this book as part of the Bible. The Jews and the Protestants do not. And so there's a whole group of books referred to as the Apocrypha that the Roman Catholic Church believes should be in the Bible, and the Jews and the Protestants believe should not be in the Bible. That's what we'll be talking about in a couple weeks. Now, the way this system worked, the whole idea of purgatory and indulgences, is it has to do with merit. The church is the gatekeeper. Yes?
I just want to say the extra books that the Catholic Church has, is it true to history, but not in the Bible?
In some cases, yeah, it records. They are significant. Some of them are historical. So the Book of Maccabees, for example, records some things that happened between the Book of Malachi, which was around 400 BC, and where the New Testament begins. So they are significant because they fill in some interesting details. And we'll talk more about that, whether they should be in or out, when we get to that topic. So the system of merits has to do with basically how do you get saved? And so Protestants we believe in Jesus and he died for us, and so we're saved in that way. At this time, the Roman Catholic Church, and perhaps still, believes that you get saved by doing good works. Certain saints, we last week talked about saints. Saints, like we'll say Steve Sweetman, if he's a saint, he is so holy and does so many good works that he has extra merits. It's like he has enough to get into heaven and then some spares. And so the church is a gatekeeper and can handle the spare merits that Steve has earned. And the way it works is if Michelle is falling a little short, she's going to purgatory, Steve's gone straight in. The church can sell you some of his merits. I am serious. So this is how, and that's called an indulgence. And people like Martin Luther became extremely upset about this. They read the Bible and said, I don't see anything about this in the Bible. 1517 is when Martin Luther nailed his theses, 95 theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. Most of the 95 theses have to do with this. He was ticked off basically because he couldn't find it in the Bible. And so he had a revelation that by believing in Jesus, I can be saved, rather than I am going to purgatory to burn some of my sins off, and if I pay some money, I can get out sooner. So most of his theses that he nailed on the door have to do with this exact issue. And it's a big thing. I don't want to get off too far on this. But it's very significant, and it ties in with how we got the Bible. And this is partly why the church structure did their best to avoid people being able to read the Bible, because then they start asking questions. Hey, I don't see that in the Bible. So it's quite significant. The Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory was developed at the Council of Florence, which lasted from 1431 to 1449. We've already talked about Luther. John Calvin, 1536, wrote the first edition of his book that is a systematic theology of Protestant thinking. It was called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. To him, this issue was so important, he devoted an entire chapter to talking about purgatory and indulgences. The indulgences are when you pay money and you get a get-out-of-jail-free card, basically, is what it was like. So he spent a whole chapter refuting this, saying it's not in the Bible. The Roman Catholic Council of Trent, which lasted from 1545 to 1563, which is after the Reformation, redefines this. You can look it up online. It's Canon number 30, they called it, where they address this issue. Anyone who preaches salvation by faith alone, or denies that sins have to be burned away in purgatory, that person is anathema. Steve, what does that word mean? Anathema. Yeah, you're cursed. And so the Council of Trent reaffirmed that if you believe in salvation by faith alone, or if you don't believe in purgatory and indulgences, you are cursed. You are going to hell. But sometime since then and now, apparently, as I said, purgatory has changed, and it's now no longer this place of suffering. But I spent hours studying this, and I can't figure out when it happened. It's sometimes between the mid-1500s and now it changed, so that's interesting. The second thing I wanted to mention is last week we talked about people getting killed and burned at the stake and so on. Under King Henry VIII, there were 63 Protestants who were burned at the stake. That's a lot, but it's a relatively low number compared to what we're going to hear about tonight. But all of those people were given a chance to recant. Who knows what the word recant means?
You know what they do?
Yeah, to change your mind. And so they had an interesting custom. If you recanted, then you would have to carry a faggot. Now, the word faggot has changed its meaning since then. What it meant then, Joan, if you faced being burnt at the stake, and they said, okay, if you change your mind and you want to be a nice Roman Catholic, then we're not going to burn you, but you're going to have to carry a faggot. And so what that means, you have to get a big piece of firewood, and you carry it down the street. I'm not sure how big, but probably big enough you couldn't just lift it up. You had to drag it. Mm-hmm. So you carry a faggot is a piece of firewood. And so you drag the faggot down the street, then you drag it into the cathedral and down the center aisle of the cathedral, and you basically lay it at the front of the cathedral, and you might kneel down and basically repent for your sin. And so the point is a very poignant point. You are admitting how close you came to that faggot being lit on fire underneath you and you being burned to death. So it's quite serious to carry a faggot, and it was humiliating, but you had saved yourself getting burnt. The interesting thing is, many of the people who recanted and carried a faggot recanted other recantation. And so they changed their mind, many of them. And so they came back twice as bold as they were before. All right, kill me, because I repent of repenting for what I believed before. And so, yeah, kill me now, because what I'm living is a lie, basically. So that was interesting. The other thing, and we're going to come into this tonight, is the amazing fact, well, Bob Dylan wrote a song called With God on Our Side. All these people that are killing other people, they believed God was on their side. They believed they were doing God's work, that to kill as many people as possible who don't believe like I do, I'm doing God's work. And so that's interesting to ponder how you get to that place in your thinking as a society, as a church, to think the more people I kill, the more I'm serving God, basically. And it relates to, for example, Islam today. Many of those people think exactly like this. The more non-Muslim people I kill, the more I'm serving God. So it's interesting. All right, we've made it up to 1547. I'm just going to go back 10 years. In 1537, Edward was born. His father is Henry VIII. His mother is Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. Not Jane Seymour, the actress. Jane Seymour back then, who probably Jane Seymour, the actress, is named after. And Henry really liked her because of his 6 wives. When he died, he requested to be buried with Jane Seymour, wife number 3. You would think it might have been a more recent wife, but no. Unfortunately, when Edward is 12 days old, his mother dies. It was very common back then. Probably the most dangerous thing a woman could ever do back then was give birth. Very high mortality rate. And that continued probably right up into the 1900s, I would say. When he's born, his half-sister Mary, from wife number 1, is 21 years old. His half-sister Elizabeth, from wife number 2, is 4 years old. Henry had a policy, the wife du jour, whatever child she had was the one who was going to inherit. And so when Elizabeth was born, he basically more or less disowned Mary. When Edward was born, he disowned Elizabeth. They were actually officially declared illegitimate. It's become a bad word now, but back then they would be called a bastard. And so others referred to them in that way. In 1543, so Edward is now born. 1543, he marries wife number 6, Catherine Parr, and Edward is 6 years old at the time, and he actually became very close with his stepmother. She was a Protestant, and they had a very good relationship with each other. 1547, King Henry VIII dies. He's 55 years old. Edward becomes the king. He's 9 years old. He's the king. Do we have some pictures up here? I got to keep on this guy. So here's some pictures of King Edward. There we go. Thank you, Tim.
How old is he then?
He's 9. Well, he reigned for a little while. So because he's only 9, he has a thing called a Regency Council, some advisors to help him run things. At his coronation, now Edward had been raised as a Protestant, mostly because of this wife number 6, who was a Protestant. At his coronation, I thought this was an interesting story. Edward is handed 3 swords. He's 9 years old. They give him 3 swords representing the 3 kingdoms he is now the king of, which is England, France, and Ireland. And he says, "Where's the 4th sword?" And he said, or his nobles said to him, "What are you talking about? What 4th sword? You only have 3 kingdoms." And he says, "The Bible, the sword of the Spirit, and that's to be preferred before these other swords." He said that. He's 9 years old, and he says, the Bible, the sword of the Spirit, is more important than being the king of England, France, and Ireland. That's amazing to me.
What did you do in that?
Well, he's the king. He's England's first Protestant king, and he had a habit that puts most of us to shame. He read 12 chapters of the Bible every day. So that's a fair bit. And many of the contemporaries, they were so pleased with him, they referred to him as the second King Josiah. Steve, who was King Josiah?
I know this one. King Josiah ruled the southern kingdom of Israel from about 642 to around 608 BC.
That's something like that.
He instituted many reforms into Israeli Jewish culture that did not take.
How old was he when he became the king?
That's right. He was really young.
He was 8.
8, yeah.
Wow.
And this Edward is very much like him because, as you say, Josiah introduced a lot of reforms to Israel, and Edward introduced a lot of reforms to England. So there are comparisons. I won't say about the presidents that some people think is the modern King Cyrus. You don't want me to talk about that one? Okay, we won't. All right. Edward had a close relationship with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and his name is Thomas Cranmer, and we're going to hear more about him. At this time, when Edward becomes king, the Church of England, remember King Henry had separated to a certain extent from the Roman Catholic Church, and so the king was now the head of the church. But the church was essentially still a Roman Catholic Church in doctrine. Between Edward and Thomas Cranmer, they start the shift towards making the Church of England a Protestant church rather than a Roman Catholic church. So here's some of the things that happened during Edward's reign. Priests are now allowed to get married. That's pretty big. Or they're allowed, many priests had a wife on the side, a secret wife and secret children. They can now publicly admit, yeah, that's been my wife for the last 20 years and those 6 kids are mine, sort of thing. So that's a big change. The Roman Catholic Mass is abolished. I don't want to get into what all that means. He declares that church services in England for the first time should be in English rather than in Latin. Imagine how big that would be for the average person. Hey, I can understand what's going on here. Ministers are encouraged to preach about justification by faith, which means by believing in Jesus, you're saved rather than doing a whole bunch of other stuff. Lay people, that's people who aren't ordained, during communion can now receive the bread and the wine. Up until then, they could only get the bread, and even in the Catholic Church today, you only get the bread, not the wine. Most of the legislation against heresy that was from previous times and from Henry VIII is repealed, and England becomes a sanctuary for persecuted Protestants from all over Europe. All kinds of Protestants start moving to England because they can be free there. During Edward's reign, at least 13 editions of the whole Bible are printed and 35 editions of the New Testament. Two former senior bishops in the Church of England under Henry, who had spearheaded killing these 63 people who were burned at the stake during the time of Edward. They're not killed, but they're thrown into the Tower of London and are now in prison. These two bishops had been responsible for, how many did I say? 63 people being burned at the stake. Edward didn't like that. 1548, Catherine Parr, wife number 6 of Henry, dies, and that leaves kind of Edward feeling like an orphan. His father's dead, now his mother's dead, or his stepmother's dead. And now we're going to tie in some of the things happening elsewhere in Europe. 1548, the first Bible in Flemish is published. Same year, the first New Testament in Finnish is published. 1548, same year, John Rogers, the editor of Matthew's Bible, which we talked about last week, he comes back to England because it's now safe to do so, and he becomes one of the ministers at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Peggy, did you go there when you went to England? St. Paul's Cathedral? It's a gigantic place. I've seen pictures. Here's an interesting thing. In 1549, at the age of 12, Edward writes a treatise or a document, a little booklet, arguing that the Pope is the Antichrist. Most 12-year-olds aren't that astute to be writing books like that.
No, they're playing video games.
Yes.
Question though, and when you made these, like you said, you had a council of people.
Yeah.
Do you think most of it was coming from that God was using him, or do you think that those men were convincing that was just the question?
Well, they were working, there's a lot written about that. He picked people that worked well with him. And so his counselors, yeah, he did. And so his counselors thought the same way that he did, basically.
Okay.
Yep, so the whole group was moving together.
Okay.
Yeah. 1549, the Act of Uniformity dictates that all churches in England should conduct services using a book that Al Reimers has brought tonight, and he's going to pass it around. This book is still used in the Anglican Church. It's called the Book of Common Prayer, and it was written by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So Al, if you wouldn't mind passing that around for people to have a look.
I would just note
Sure.
that you could say that the prayer book is just the Bible rearranged.
Mm-hmm.
It is almost completely scripture all the way through. The directions are printed in italics normally. A few in some editions are printed in red, and then they're called rubrics. But most of the directions are in italics, and the rest is scripture.
1550, the first complete Bible in Norwegian is published. Now I'm going to just briefly talk about a guy from Paris He's a French guy. His name is Robert Estienne, but he had the nickname, a Latin nickname, Stephanus. And so if you were to Google him, if you just Googled Stephanus, not Steve Sweetman, Stephanus, and he's going to come up. And he was a printer of classical works, but he's most famous for publishing 4 editions of the Greek New Testament. And the first 3 in 1546, 1549, and 1550 are printed in Paris, but the French Roman Catholic authorities are ticked off with this guy. And so he's getting persecuted, and for the sake of his life, he leaves France and he moves to Switzerland, to Geneva. That's where John Calvin was living. So he publishes his 3rd edition in 1550, and I'm just going to talk about that briefly. This is the first printed Greek New Testament to include variant readings of the text in footnotes, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, what a variant reading is. When he made his 3rd edition, he had a total of 14 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Nowadays, we have thousands of them, but he had 14. And remember when I talked about Erasmus back in 1516, published his Greek New Testament, he had a total of 7 manuscripts to work with. So he's got double the manuscripts, and they don't all agree with each other. So in little footnotes at the bottom, he mentions where there's some questions on that. 1550, Joan Butcher is burned at the stake after spending more than a year in prison. Now, this is during the reign of Edward, and during the reign of Edward, only 2 people are burned at the stake or executed. During his father's reign, 63 had been killed. So Joan is one of them. She was a friend of Anne Askew that we talked about last week, who they racked and so on. She was involved in smuggling copies of this book into England. We've seen pictures. Women, Michelle, wore great big dresses and skirts back then. They were very handy for smuggling Bibles. So she had all kinds of little pockets in her dress, and they were full of Bibles. She was smuggling them in. So that's not a bad thing. But her heresy was she denied the humanity of Christ, that Jesus is man and God. She said he's only God, he wasn't man. And there's a name for that we won't get into. There was a person of Christ that they thought that was worthy of burning her for. 1551, April 25th. Yep. This is Joan Butcher. Bocher. Sounds like a Dutch name to me. 1550, May 2nd. Boucher? Okay, thank you. And then in 1551, April 25th, the second person, and the last person executed during the reign of Edward, George van Paris. He's a Dutch surgeon who lived in London. His heresy was basically he was a Jehovah's Witness. He was an Arian. He denied the divinity of Christ. Joan had denied the humanity of Christ. George van Paris denied the divinity of Christ, like Jehovah's Witnesses do. So he's burned at the stake for the exact opposite heresy. 1551, Stephanus publishes his 4th edition of the Greek New Testament. Do I have pictures of that? Tim, I don't think I do. And that was now printed in Geneva in Switzerland. And the interesting thing about this one is it's the first time that the text of the New Testament is divided into verses. Verses didn't exist until 1551, and so up until then, if you read a Bible, it was just paragraphs and so on. And he thought, hey, it'd be interesting if we divided the Bible, in this case the New Testament, into verses. So if you want to find a spot, other people could find it easily. So
Do you
he's the
do
guy,
chapters too, or just verses?
probably chapters too, I would think. So the verses are all numbered, and that's the first time, 1551. And also in 1551, the Spanish Inquisition bans the Bible in Spanish or any other language except Latin. So if you live in Spain and you're caught with a Bible in any language other than Latin, then you are liable to execution. And so they're using the Latin Vulgate from 405. It's now 1,150 years old, and that's what you must use if you live in Spain. And it wasn't very long earlier that that's what you had to use if you lived in England, too. 1552, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, revises that Book of Common Prayer that's going around. He also prepares a doctrinal statement called the 42 Articles. Now, later on, that number is going to change, but it's the 42 Articles, and he basically lists what the Church of England believes. As we've already seen, the Book of Common Prayer is still used today, and it's 466 years old. So that's interesting. 1553, Edward gets tuberculosis.
How old is he then?
He's 15, and he dies. He had had dreams of turning England into, quote, an evangelical realm of Christ, is what he wanted. He's worried about his two half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, that they won't follow his dream. And so he does his best to not allow them to succeed him as the ruler, particularly Mary. So he decrees that his Protestant second cousin, Lady Jane Grey, Tim, I've got pictures, is to succeed him and become the next ruler. She's the great niece of Henry VIII. Edward's so concerned that this might not happen that he has over 100 top government officials sign the document where he says Lady Jane Grey is going to become the queen. He has been the king for 6 years. He dies at the age of 15. His funeral is conducted by his friend, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. At this time, Mary is 36 years old. Elizabeth is 19. By the way, in 1553, the first New Testament in Polish is published. Now we're going to talk about Lady Jane Grey. We got some pictures up here. She becomes the queen, 1553, July 10th. She is 16 years old. Anyone here know any 16-year-old girls? So imagine. Now, Edward was 9 when he became the king. Jane is 16 when she becomes the queen. She is the queen for 9 days. And then she's deposed by Mary, who didn't like not being the queen. And she had gathered up an army and supporters. Jane is sent to the Tower of London, a prison, where she is in jail for 7 months. 1554, in February, after spending 7 months in prison, Jane gets her head chopped off. She's 17 years old.
And that's her, she's in the Catholic.
Well, she would be a cousin of Mary.
Oh, okay.
So she was the great niece of Henry VIII, whereas Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII. Along with her, when she gets her head cut off, a bunch of her relatives and various people who had helped Edward carry out this mission of her becoming the queen, they all get killed. A bunch of people get killed. Here's quite a story. This is where I get choked up. Before he cuts her head off, the executioner asks Jane to forgive him. And she does. And then she says to him, basically, please do it quickly. Her exact words were recorded. I pray you dispatch me quickly. She lays her head down. They call it the block. Wham. And just before he cuts her head off, she quotes the last words of Jesus on the cross, as recorded by Luke. And she says, Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. So that's pretty profound, I think, for a 17-year-old girl who was the queen for 9 days. So now Queen Mary I is the queen. She's 37. This is Jane Grey. I don't think Grey's Anatomy is named after her, but they've made movies of her or about her. So Queen Mary I becomes the queen. She's 37. She's the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had given birth to 6 children, but only one of them survived past a few weeks, and that was Mary. As soon as she becomes a queen, now we just learned 7 months later she had Jane Grey and her friends and relatives executed. She also places her half-sister Elizabeth under house arrest. So this is serious stuff. She is consolidating her power. And she is a fervent Roman Catholic and is determined to return England to Catholicism by reversing basically everything that Edward had done. 1553 in August. So Mary becomes the queen on July 19th. Less than a month later, John Rogers, who was the editor of Matthew's Bible and is one of the ministers at St. Paul's Cathedral, is arrested. First he's under house arrest and then he's thrown into the Tower of London. The next month, September 1553, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who wrote that book that's going around, he is arrested and he spends 2.5 years in the Tower of London. And this spreads out. Numerous top church officials who were in that position during Edward's reign, they're all thrown into jail.
So Robert, can I interject a question? Tower of London, is it a tower or is it?
Yeah, it is a tower, but it's a jail, basically. It's a prison, and not a nice jail either.
So was it all these levels? Or
Yeah, it's like a castle.
I was there.
Does it look like a castle?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The room where she was beheaded.
Jane?
And
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
yeah, it was up on the 5th floor or something. It was just all just what do you call it? Mortar, brick and mortar. It was barren, you know. It was very.
Yeah. At that time, a lot of people died in prison. You didn't get to be executed, you just died in jail because it was so horrible and miserable. The Archbishop of Canterbury is now in the Tower of London, where he spends 2.5 years. The next month, October 1553, Mary officially cancels all religious reforms that were made under Edward VI. Everything that Edward did, she cancels it. She restores, last week we talked about the 6 articles that Henry had brought in that basically ensured everyone was a good Roman Catholic in their thinking and theology, while he had separated from the Pope. The church was still basically Roman Catholic. So one of the problems this created, during the reign of Edward VI, he had said, priests can get married. Guess what? They all went and got married. Now Mary says, oh no, you can't be married. And so they have 2 choices. You can divorce your wife or you're fired. That's a tough choice. In 1554, in March, Mary's half-sister Elizabeth, who's 21 years old, is arrested, and she goes to the Tower of London for 2 months. And then she's returned to house arrest. So she's been under arrest either at home or in jail this whole time. 1554 in July, Mary marries Philip II, the King of Spain, and Jim, I got pictures of him. They meet for the first time 2 days before their wedding. And so this is all arranged as a political thing. Also, Philip can't speak English. He speaks Spanish. But he's the son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled most of Europe. So his son is running Spain and a bunch of other countries. Mary's actually his second wife. He eventually had 4 different wives, and they all seemed to die. He's a very fervent Roman Catholic and an avid supporter of the Spanish Inquisition, which we had talked about. As the King of Spain, he spends almost all his time in Spain and occasionally visits Mary in England. Mary never goes to Spain to visit her husband.
Notice right there, the men wearing tights back there.
Yeah, maybe I should start that.
When I'm doing something at the long time, the guys are coming up, they're wearing tights underneath their shorts and
Oh, okay.
it's a thing like I said, like it helps their muscles or keeps them warm. But they're,
All right. I better get on trend then. Next week I'll be having my tights maybe.
like, they're so fit of all these women, right?
Yeah.
Do they have like short ones? That's really different.
Leave it to Michelle.
Coming back, yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. So this was in July that she married Philip, and then sometime after that, in the same year, the Church of England is returned to being under the authority of the Pope. And so Mary never claims to be the head of the church. The Pope is now once again the head of the church in England. She had already canceled any religious reforms made by her half-brother Edward. She now also cancels any religious reforms that her father, Henry VIII, had made, because he had been gradually moving to be semi-Protestant. They're all canceled too. And then in November that year, 1554, 3 general and sweeping heresy acts dating back to 1382, 1401, and 1414 are revived. After this date, this is November 1554, if you live in England and you are not a Roman Catholic, you can be killed. You are now officially a heretic. Everyone in England must be Roman Catholic or you can be executed. As a result, hundreds of Protestants move out of England. They move to Europe, especially to Geneva in Switzerland, where John Calvin is in charge.
And also, Mary was married to this Reverend.
Yeah.
What was his name?
Philip.
So you said she never did come, like, did they ever come?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, he came to England occasionally, but she never went to Spain.
But so how can you, my point is bring out that how can you marry them? They would make it
Yeah. That's common. Yeah. So we're proceeding with Mary. 1555, this is into the next year, Queen Mary now makes it illegal to own or to read a Bible in English in England. We're going back to Latin again.
And how many English Bibles were there then?
Well, there were, still primarily this one, but also Coverdale had one, and Henry had actually put them into churches. The Great Bible, which was translated in 1539, I don't think I had pictures of it there, but Henry, 14 years early, Henry VIII had said, I think every church in England should have a Bible. And so they had put Bibles in, they chained them to a stand, and that's where I talked about the problem it caused, because people were lined up out the doors waiting to get a chance to read the Bible for the first time, and ministers were complaining people would rather read the Bible than listen to my sermon, so it was causing a lot of disruption. Well, Mary put an end to that. She took all those Bibles out of every church and had them all burned.
Oh, she did not. Wow, that's
She did.
beautiful. So thousands, we're talking thousands.
Yeah. And so, again, it's an interesting thing to ponder that why would the church was so desperate to avoid people being able to read the Bible. It's a very interesting consideration. So all those Bibles that Henry put in are now taken out and burned. She also bans all writings by any Protestant writers such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, Miles Coverdale, Erasmus, William Tyndale, etc. If you're caught with one of those books, you're in serious trouble. Then, 1555 in February, at Mary's command, the execution of Protestants begins. And this normally happens by burning at the stake. Now, in the next 3 years, she has about 300 people killed for their faith. So that's an average of 2 per week. Henry had only killed 63, but she kills about 300. It's a distressing thing to even talk about all this, and so I'm going to mention some people, and I thought, well, the interesting thing is, and this is perhaps being economic, it was quite common, if probably all of you in this room would have been killed at this time anyway. And so rather than kill you one at a time and waste all that firewood, it was very common kill the whole bunch together. And so multiple people would be burned at the same time, I guess to save on faggots, the fuel. I thought, well, I'll list all the where 3 or more are killed together. And oh, it's too many. So I actually went through and I only kept where 4 or more are burned together because it would take too long. But I thought to honor some of these people, I'll just mention some of these cases. Some I'm going to mention by name. And so it's a horrendous thing. I've actually had nightmares about this. Oh, it's and we're non-discriminatory at this time. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, you're going to get burnt. And it's also quite common, Joan, you and Lloyd would be burned together. And Marlene and Jim, you're going to be burned together. And so couples would be burned together, and so on. A lot of these people who are killed, they were high-ranking church officials during the reign of Edward, but now they're considered heretics. And accounts indicate Mary, as I mentioned earlier, she actually believes the more Protestants I kill, the more God will be pleased with me. I am doing the work of the Lord by cleansing these heretics out of my country. And so she goes at it with a passion. The first heretic to be killed, Tim, I got a picture of him, John Rogers, the guy who is the editor for Matthew's Bible. Some call him the translator, but he was more of an editor and a translator. And he's also one of the ministers at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He's already been in jail for a year and a half. He's the first one to be burned, February 4th. As part of his punishment, his wife and 11 children are forced to watch him. That seems a little excessive cruelty to me. February 9th, 5 days later, former bishop, and not everyone here might know what a bishop is. In the Anglican Church, what's a bishop?
A bishop is the chief pastor of an area called a diocese. And England is divided, as almost every Roman Catholic country is divided into dioceses. And as the chief pastor, he has the privilege of making rules in that area. In the Roman Catholic Church, of course, they have the Bishop of Rome, who is the bishop of all the bishops.
Right. Thank you. And so Mary starts clearing out these bishops that had been bishops under Edward VI. They were Protestants, and she wants to get rid of them. So John Hooper, I've got a picture of him. He's been in jail for 6 months, and he's burned at the stake. And he had gotten married during the reign of Edward VI, and when he was given the choice, divorce your wife or lose your job, he chose to lose his job and kept his wife. And so that was kind of nice. But he's burned at the stake. And then that March, Bishop Robert Farrar is burned at the stake. July 12, 1555, in the city of Canterbury, 4 men are burned together. It's very efficient. They would sometimes use one post and have 2 people at each post or this sort of thing and just pile the firewood around them. August 23rd, 1555, again in Canterbury, 6 men are burned together. September 6th, same year, again in Canterbury, 5 men are burned together. October 16th, 2 former bishops of the Church of England, Tim, I have their picture here, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley are burned at the stake together. I would think maybe there's an advantage to not being burnt by yourself, to have some companions with you. Maybe you can encourage each other in this process. 1555 in December, John Philpott, the former Archdeacon of Winchester, is burned at the stake. And now, what's an archdeacon?
Well, it's an administrative. He's usually the chief administrator of the diocese.
Okay. So a high-ranking official. 1556, January 27th, in Smithfield, which is a suburb of London, 5 men and 2 women are burned together, 7 at a time. January 31st, same year, in Canterbury, 1 man, 4 women are burned together. 1556, I've got a picture, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a supporter of John Rogers Matthews' Bible and of Miles Coverdale's Great Bible. He's the author of the Book of Common Prayer that went around. He's burned at the stake. April 24th, in Smithfield, 6 men are burned together. April 28th, 4 days later, in Colchester, 6 men are burned together. June 6th, in Lewes, 4 men are burned together. June 27th, at Stratford at Bow. This is a big one. 11 men and 2 women are burned together. That's 13 people. So that takes a bit of organization to have 13 people all burned together at the same time. 1556, July 18th. Tim, I have some pictures here. The Guernsey Martyrs. Guernsey is a town on the Channel Islands off the coast of Normandy. Catherine Cochez and her 2 adult daughters, Guillemine Gilbert and Peratine Massey, are burned together at the stake for being Protestants. The gruesome part of the story is Peratine is pregnant, and she's close to delivery time. While she's burning, her abdomen bursts open and a baby leaps out into the flames. A bystander grabs the baby out of the fire and asks the authorities, what do I do with this baby boy? And he's told, toss him back in the fire. He's burning with his mother. So that's what they did. And so it's, at this point, a lot of now you might have noticed, it appears that burning people at the stake is not quelling Protestantism. You think, hey, this is a bad idea being a Protestant, but people keep getting burned. They keep believing in the Lord in this way, but when they start throwing babies in fires, the general population really started to dislike what was happening in their country. But it carries on. September 24th, in Mayfield, 5 men are burned together. January 15th, 1557, in Canterbury again, 6 men are burned together. April 12th, in Smithfield again, 3 men, 2 women are burned together. June 18th, in Maidstone, 2 men and 5 women are burned together. A total of 7. June 19th, again in Canterbury, 3 men, 4 women are burned together. June 22nd, in Lewes, 6 men and 4 women are burned together. That's 10 people. August 2nd, in Colchester, 5 men, 5 women are burned together. Probably couples, I presume. 1557, in August, the date wasn't actually recorded in Rochester, not New York. 2 men, 2 women are burned together. September 17th in Islington. There's a street in Toronto named after this town. 3 men, 1 woman burned together. Now, a little break. In 1557, the Geneva New Testament is published. It's called Geneva New Testament because it's not safe to have this in England. It's published in Switzerland. I've got a copy of it right here. This is actually the whole Bible, which I talked about the Old Testament coming out. The whole Bible was published 3 years later, but I'll pass this around. And this is an exact copy of what was published. And this becomes a very significant book. So we're just talking about the New Testament right now. This is 1557. The New Testament comes out, is published in Geneva, Switzerland. The translator is William Whittingham. He's the brother-in-law of John Calvin. And John Calvin writes an introduction for the book. Yeah.
In what language was it published?
English.
In Switzerland.
In Switzerland. It's not safe to publish this in England. And so it has 4 notables features. Now it's basically a revision of this book, William Tyndale's translation. And so they've looked at it and made some revisions. And so for the first time in an English Bible, it has verses. Remember I mentioned the Greek New Testament had verses, and so they use those verse divisions. And so now if you say, look up Matthew 6:13, you can actually look it up. Prior to that, you couldn't do that. So that's a first. Number 2, it uses more colloquial everyday language than any previous English version. Number 3, it uses a different type font to indicate words that are added to aid in the sense of a translation. They're not specifically in the Greek, but sometimes you have to use some extra words so it makes sense. And so that's a first. And the King James Version does the same thing later on. But probably what it's most famous for, it has extensive study notes and footnotes. It's the first, what we today would call a study Bible. Now, the interesting thing is, everyday people absolutely love this book, and it becomes extremely popular. I'm going to talk about it more when I get up to the Old Testament portion in 3 years. We're on to burning people again. 1558, June 27th, in Smithfield, 7 men are burned together. July 14th, in Brentford, 6 men are burned together. July 25th, in Bury St. Edmunds, 4 men are burned together. Now, that summer, in 1558, John Knox, he's the founder of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. He's getting kind of ticked off at what he's seeing going on in England, and he writes a book where, and I won't even tell you the title, it's kind of a nasty title, but he basically condemns Mary and what she's doing in England, killing all these people.
Who's that?
John Knox. If you go around the countryside looking at Presbyterian churches, probably half of them are have the word Knox in there somewhere. November 15th, in Canterbury, 3 men and 2 men are burned together. November 17th, Mary dies. She's 42 years old. And she's reigned for 5 years. She's been burning people at the stake for 3 years, and at a rate of, on average, 2 per week. And so there's a respite happens. So Queen Elizabeth I becomes the queen November 1558, and she's actually going to reign for 44 years. During her reign, a total of 9 Protestants are executed. They're radical Protestants is the technical term, and I'll mention a couple of them. So she's 25 years old when she becomes a queen. As I said, she rules for 44 years, up until 1603. She's the daughter of Henry VIII and wife number 2, Anne Boleyn. Her father had had her mother beheaded when Elizabeth was 2 years, 8 months old. You think that might do something to you if you know my father had my mother killed. But she might have been too young to remember. Now remember King Philip, the guy with the tights who married Mary, he proposes to her and says, hey, your sister's dead, why don't we get married? But she turns him down. A little while later, Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of Russia, proposes to her. She turns him down too. And she has lots of suitors. She's a very powerful woman, and most people then would get married for political reasons and have children so the children can carry on. That she never does get married. Elizabeth, have we got pictures going here? Michelle, she's got some nice dresses, doesn't she? Yes. Those are wigs. They're all wigs, yeah. Because she had smallpox, and so she was mostly bald, and she had horrible skin blemishes, so she wears very heavy makeup like this, and she always wears a wig. And then later in life, she had a morbid fear of dentists, and by the end of her life, she's lost all her teeth, basically, and people complain it's hard to understand her when she talks. But she's very well educated. She can speak or write 11 languages. English, French, Flemish, Italian, Spanish, Latin, Greek, Welsh, Cornish, and Scottish, and Irish. Now she is determined. She has seen what happened with her father, Henry VIII. She has seen what happened with Edward VI, her half-brother. She has seen what happened with her half-sister Mary. She determines to take what is referred to as a middle road. I'm not going to be too Protestant like Edward. I'm not going to be too Roman Catholic like Mary. I'm going to attempt to walk a path down the middle. And so we'll see how that goes. 1558, the Act of Supremacy. Guess what? The Church of England is no longer under the Pope. It's now under Elizabeth. She doesn't want to be called the supreme head of the church. So she is called the supreme governor of the Church of England. Priests are now allowed to get married again. 10 laws that related to religion that had been proclaimed by her father Henry VIII but had been reversed by Mary I are reinstated. So she's moving towards being more Protestant there. All clergy are required to take an oath of loyalty to Queen Elizabeth or get fired. As a result of that, every bishop that had been appointed by Mary except one gets fired because they refuse to take an oath of loyalty to Queen Elizabeth. They're loyal to the Pope. Many of the Protestants who had moved to Europe during the reign of Mary now returned to England. Then in 1559, in May, the Act of Uniformity, this act makes Protestantism the official religion of England, but it did retain some elements of Catholicism. Once again, every church in England has to use the Book of Common Prayer, the book that Al passed around there. Part of the problem is in her attempt to take a middle path, Elizabeth has two groups of people who are now upset with her. They're the group that's on this side and on this side. And so Roman Catholics are not happy because for them the Church of England is now too Protestant. And they also resent having anyone other than the Pope being the head of the church, especially a woman. Meanwhile, the Puritans, that's basically a name for fervent Protestants, they're not happy. For them, the Church of England is too Catholic still. And they also don't like having to use this Book of Common Prayer. Why can't we just have a church service where we just say and do what we want instead of having to follow along in a book? You see, so they don't like that. Yes, she dies not married. So,
What age did she die?
oh, when she became the queen? Let's see, what did I say there? She was 25. 44 years. Yeah. 70. She died at the age of 70, which is pretty old back then. So remember, Henry put Bibles in all the churches, and obviously Edward left them there, and then Mary took all the Bibles out of the churches. Elizabeth puts them all back in again. And so I guess if you're a Bible printer, this is good business. The only Bible the most up-to-date Bible at this time was the Great Bible, which had been translated in 1539. That's the same one that Henry had put in. I'm going to talk about that Geneva Bible a little more here shortly. So here's an interesting thing. There's a law passed. It is mandatory that every single person must attend church every Sunday and every holy day. If you refuse to attend church, now this is not, oh, I'm sick today, I'm not going to church today, but if you refuse, no, I'm not going, like Steve Sweetman didn't go to church for 9 years, he would have been in serious trouble. And so you are fined 12 pence, which is a lot of money for poor people. The money collected from the fines is to be given to poor people. But those who end up having to pay these fines are the people on the right and the left. If you're Roman Catholic, you don't want to go to this Anglican church. You have to pay a fine for refusing to go. If you're a Puritan, you don't want to go to this Anglican church. It's too Roman Catholic. You have to pay a fine for not going.
And you mentioned also on holy days?
Yeah, so there's... Now, what are holy days?
Generally speaking, they're the days remembering great events in the life of our Lord. So, for instance, not only Christmas, but also the Feast of the Circumcision, when Jesus was circumcised on the 8th day, would be a holy day. The Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul. Nobody knows exactly, but it's celebrated in January. The Saints' Days, the Apostles, the 12 Apostles, and St. John the Baptist Day. And there's quite a variety. Mostly they're people, but there's also events that are holy days. And we get the word holiday from holy day.
So that might not fall on a Sunday. That could be a Wednesday or a Tuesday or something,
yes.
right? And so you have to go to church on Sunday plus the holy days, or else you're in trouble. Now I'm looking at my clock here, and it's the time I'm supposed to quit. I would like to just finish talking about this Geneva Bible, and then we'll take any questions or comments. That's the Bible I'm passing around. Before I get to that, just two things. In 1559, the heresy laws, which made it punishable by execution to not be a Roman Catholic, are repealed under Elizabeth. Now, let's just talk about that Geneva Bible. So in 1560, the complete Bible comes out, is printed in Geneva, Switzerland. It's the work of a bunch of Bible scholars. Up until now, most of the translations have been the work of one person. They used the New Testament that William Whittingham had published 3 years earlier. And other people that worked on it are Miles Coverdale. We've heard about him a couple of times. John Knox, we've heard about him. John Calvin, we've heard about him. And Theodore Beza, which we'll learn more about him later. He's quite a Greek scholar. They use more Hebrew and Greek manuscripts as source material than any English translation up to this time. And so that's significant. It's the first complete English Bible to ever be divided into verses. So the Old Testament is now in verses. And I should mention, I skipped it here, in 1559, verse numbers are used in the Old Testament for the first time in a Hebrew Old Testament that was published. So they base their verses in the Geneva Bible on that Old Testament in Hebrew that was now in verses. It's printed in more readable type. Up until now, Bibles had always been printed in what is called Gothic type, which looks like calligraphy. When I look at it, I can barely read it. And so this is the most readable English Bible that had ever been published. It's a much more easy to decipher type. It's called Roman type. And as I mentioned before, it's a study Bible. It's got all kinds of footnotes, study aids, and instructions about or introductions to books, illustrations, maps, verse cross references. So people who are students of the Bible, they just love this. Demand is so great, over the next 84 years, it's reprinted 150 times, sometimes with different modifications. It's printed in various sizes, and so for the first time, instead of a Bible being half the size of this table, it can be small. This is for a complete Bible. So they print pocket editions as well as bigger editions. It's never officially accepted in England, but it quickly becomes a standard household Bible. Because so many copies are printed, this becomes, up until now, the most affordable Bible ever. It will only cost you 1 week's wages. So think of what a week's wage is. Today in Canada, I think I said it was $51,000 a year. $51,700 was a standard wage over the course of a year. So we'll say you can buy this Bible for only $1,000. That's a great deal, because prior to that, the Wittenberg Bible, for example, cost you $150,000. It was 3 years' wages. And so this is the cheapest Bible that had ever come out at only 1 week's wages. The Puritans love it. They like the footnotes. And so the people that use this Bible would include William Shakespeare, Oliver Cromwell, John Knox, John Bunyan, the guy who wrote one of the most popular books in Christian history called Pilgrim's Progress. This is a Bible when the Pilgrims went on a ship called the Mayflower to the United States. That's the Bible they took with them. The footnotes, if you get into the footnotes, they tend to be anti-Catholic. And so in England, as Elizabeth is trying to walk a middle path, she doesn't like anti-Catholic. She's not anti-Catholic herself. And so she doesn't like it, and the Anglican Church doesn't like it, because it has these anti-Catholic footnotes. King James, who comes later, he doesn't like it either. And so it's never officially accepted. This Geneva Bible is sometimes referred to as the Breeches Bible. A lot of Bibles have nicknames. It's called the Breeches Bible because in Genesis 3:7, it says, it's got some weird spelling here from that time. I'll just say it in modern English. It's referring to Adam and Eve. Then the eyes of them both were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig tree leaves together and made themselves breeches. So it's called the Breeches Bible. In the King James Version in 1611, they changed the word breeches to aprons. They made themselves aprons. Instead of they made themselves breeches. That's all I'm going to say tonight. I did pretty good. Only half a page I didn't talk about. We'll do that next time. So any questions or comments? And yes, John.
William Mary, who professed to be the Dove Catholic,
Yeah.
and again looked to Rome for leadership. How did Rome and her reconcile the fact that she was breaking one of the commandments of thou shalt not kill?
Well, it basically, if you're a heretic, it's like a gangrene in the church. It has to be cut off, and the way to do it is kill that person.
So the Pope didn't feel that was contrary to God's law?
Well, not at all. In the Spanish Inquisition, thousands of people were killed in Spain. So this is only 300.
It's a valid point, you know, like.
Oh, it's a very good point.
You know, how do you justify? You meet people who say, oh, you know, this is better than a Christian, and I don't want to do anything with that. And, you know, it's a valid point, like, from that
I agree.
perspective. You know, but,
Yeah.
you know, I was kind of encouraging that, what God, you know, there's what God is doing that. Like,
Yeah. Well, it's like I said at the beginning, this is a quandary to be wrestled with. Christians doing evil and they think they're doing good, basically. Yes, John.
Yeah, just in the secular world, I had this discussion not long ago, that even in wartime, when you feel the enemy country, you have religious leaders on both sides blessing the troops going into battle. In fact, the German Wehrmacht, which was the German regular army, had Gaiman God on the belt buckle, a gold God.
Yeah.
So it just shows you can even though it was a religious thing, they were both being go safely into battle.
I was like the Bob Dylan song you mentioned, with God on our side. He talks about that each side thinks God is on their side and they're doing God's work and killing each other. Other questions, comments? And John, thank you. I neglected to mention that Mary earned the nickname Bloody Mary. This time it wasn't a drink. She killed so many people that that's what they refer to as Bloody Mary.
And does that drink stem off, like, by smoke?
I doubt it. I don't know. I can't imagine that. Yeah, a Bloody Mary.
And the Geneva Bible that was
Printed in Geneva and translated in Geneva as well, because it wasn't safe to do it in England. So next week we're going to finish. I'm going to get up to the King James Version one way or another, and then we'll stop there as far as the history of the Bible in English. We're going to go back, talk about the canon, and then we're going to talk about textual criticism before I go back to what happens with the English Bible.